Imagine a child, just 12 years old, at an age when most kids are still playing games, going to school and learning about the world. This boy was already walking down a path so dark that he would soon be remembered as one of the most terrifying figures in American crime history. His name was Jesse Pomeroy, and he would become known as the 12-year-old monster. In the early 1870s, America was still a young nation recovering from the Civil War. Cities like Boston were expanding, filled with working-class families trying to build a better life. Children roamed the streets freely, playing in neighborhoods without fear, because the idea that a child could be a predator, let alone a killer, was almost unthinkable. Yet in this very environment, Jesse Pomeroy emerged. Jesse wasn't like other children. He was bullied for his physical appearance. One of his eyes was milky white due to a condition that left him partially blind. Kids teased him, calling him names and avoiding him, and Jesse seemed to internalize their cruelty, twisting it into something darker. Soon, he wasn't just a victim, he became a tormentor. By the time Jesse was 12, he had developed a frightening obsession with pain and control. He lured younger children into hidden areas, away from public view, and subjected them to horrific beatings and torture. This was not childish mischief. This was cruelty at a level that horrified even hardened police officers when they finally discovered the truth. But Jesse didn't stop there. His thirst for violence grew. What began as torture escalated into murder. By age 14, he had killed more than once. Newspapers branded him with names like the Boy Fiend and the youngest serial killer in America. Parents warned their children never to stray far from home. The question that haunted America was simple. How could a boy so young commit crimes so brutal? Was he insane? Was he born evil? Or had society itself created this monster by rejecting and humiliating him? This is the story of Jesse Pomeroy, the child who became a killer. In this documentary, we'll uncover his early life, his descent into violence, the crimes that shocked the nation, and the trial that forced America to question how justice should be delivered when the criminal is only a child. To understand how Jesse Pomeroy became a killer, we must first look at his childhood. Jesse was born on November 29, 1859 in Charlestown, Massachusetts. His family was working class and life was not easy. His father, Thomas Pomeroy, was known to be a harsh man, strict, often violent and abusive toward his wife and children. His mother, Ruth Ann, was more compassionate, but she had little power to shield Jesse from his father's temper. From birth, Jesse had a distinctive appearance. He suffered from a condition that left his right eye completely white, giving him a haunting, almost ghostly look. In the 19th century, physical differences were rarely met with kindness. Children mocked him, calling him names, and even adults treated him with unease. He became a social outcast long before he ever committed a crime. Loneliness shaped Jesse's world. He spent long hours by himself, avoiding groups of children who ridiculed him, but instead of making him gentle or reserved, isolation seemed to nurture a dangerous imagination. By the time he was 10, Jesse had begun to develop violent fantasies. Some accounts suggest he enjoyed reading about war, battles, and executions. He fixated on images of suffering, perhaps seeing them as a form of power he lacked in his own life. It's important to remember the environment in which Jesse grew up. The mid-19th century was not a time of modern psychology or understanding of child behavior. Harsh discipline was normal. Abuse at home was common and often ignored. Bullying was rarely addressed. Jesse lived in a world where cruelty was routine, but he took it further than anyone could have expected. His earliest acts of violence began with animals. Like many serial killers in history, Jesse started by targeting creatures weaker than himself. Neighbors reported that he would harm stray cats or dogs, an early sign of his capacity for cruelty. Soon, however, animals were not enough. Jesse turned his attention to children, boys younger and smaller than him. He would lure them away with promises of games or secrets, leading them into isolated places like empty fields, train yards, or sheds. Once they were alone, Jesse's demeanor would change. The shy, awkward boy suddenly transformed into a tormentor. He tied children up, beat them with sticks, cut them with knives, and threatened to kill them if they told anyone. By age 11, Jesse's pattern was clear. He was not simply acting out of anger or retaliation against bullies. He seemed to enjoy the fear, the control, and the suffering he inflicted. Each attack made him bolder. Each victim gave him more confidence. His family noticed his strange behavior but didn't fully understand the depth of his violence. His mother, Ruth Ann, defended him whenever others accused him of wrongdoing. She seemed unable or unwilling to believe that her son was capable of the horrors he was committing. This blind loyalty would later play a significant role in how Jesse's case unfolded. But by 1871, Jesse's crimes were no longer a secret. Word spread through the neighborhood of a boy who was attacking younger children. Parents began to worry. Some even complained to the police, and soon Jesse's violence would bring him into direct conflict with the law for the first time. Bullying left deep scars on Jesse's mind. Children taunted him relentlessly for his eye, calling him frog or blindy. They laughed at him, excluded him, and in a time before anti-bullying awareness, no one stepped in to help. Jesse learned that the world was cruel, and he responded by becoming crueler. But while most bullied children might withdraw or seek approval, Jesse sought domination. He discovered that inflicting pain gave him a twisted sense of power. When he held a younger child captive, Jesse was no longer the victim, he was in control. Reports from the time describe how Jesse would corner younger boys, strip them of their clothes and whip them with sticks or belts. In some cases, he used knives to cut their skin, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. Witnesses recalled that Jesse's face would change during these acts. He seemed almost possessed, consumed by sadistic pleasure. The violence escalated quickly. In one notorious incident in 1871, Jesse lured a boy into a secluded marsh area. There, he tied the child's hands and feet and beat him savagely. He cut the boy with a knife and even threatened to gouge out his eyes. The victim survived but was left traumatized and terrified. These attacks became more frequent. Jesse seemed to operate with a chilling method. He would target children who trusted him or who were too young to resist. He always chose places where no one could hear the cries for help. And after each attack, he would warn his victims not to tell anyone, or he would come back and kill them. Despite his attempts to silence them, word began to spread. Parents whispered about the strange Pomeroy boy. Rumors circulated about his cruelty, and soon the police began hearing complaints. Eventually, in 1871, Jesse was arrested for assaulting several younger children. This was Jesse's first encounter with the justice system. Because of his age, the court decided not to send him to prison but instead placed him in a reform school, a place meant to rehabilitate troubled boys. Authorities hoped that with strict discipline and structure, Jesse might change his ways. But they were wrong. Reform school did not cure Jesse Pomeroy. In fact, it may have made him worse. Inside, Jesse was exposed to even harsher discipline, abuse, and violence. Instead of teaching him empathy, it reinforced the idea that strength came from domination. He learned to suppress his urges temporarily, but deep inside, his violent fantasies continued to grow. By the time Jesse was released from reform school, he was no longer just a bully or a sadistic child. He was on the path to becoming something far more dangerous, a killer. When Jesse Pomeroy returned from reform school, he was only about 13 years old. To most people, that would have meant a chance to start fresh, a clean slate, a new life. But Jesse wasn't like most boys. Reform school had not softened him. Instead, it had hardened him, shaping him into someone colder, more calculating, and far more dangerous. The punishments he had endured there, the strict routines, the physical beatings from older boys, the harsh discipline of the staff, didn't break him. They sharpened him. Reform school taught Jesse that cruelty was not only normal, but also a means of survival, and for a child already obsessed with pain and control, that was like pouring gasoline onto a fire. When Jesse returned home, his mother, Ruth Ann, welcomed him with open arms. She insisted to neighbors that her son was misunderstood, that people exaggerated his behavior. She wanted to believe Jesse could be good, that he was simply a troubled boy who needed love. But behind her blind devotion, Jesse was already planning his next steps. At first, Jesse seemed to restrain himself. Perhaps he realized that after his release the police were still watching him closely, but his violent urges didn't vanish. They simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment. Soon, small incidents began to occur again. Children in the neighborhood reported being chased or harassed by Jesse. Some claimed he threatened them with knives. Others said he lured them with promises of games or candy, only to frighten them once they were alone. Parents grew uneasy, whispering among themselves that Jesse was up to his old tricks. And then, the violence escalated. Jesse was no longer satisfied with simply beating or frightening his victims. He craved more. He wanted to see suffering on a larger scale, to push the limits of his control. It was during this time that Jesse began carrying knives more frequently. He seemed fascinated by blades, the shine, the sharpness, the potential for harm. He practiced with them, testing their edges, and in his imagination he rehearsed the attacks he longed to carry out. One chilling report from the era describes Jesse tormenting a boy in a secluded field, pressing a knife against his skin and threatening to cut out his eyes. Though the boy escaped with his life, the terror he experienced was profound. Parents could no longer ignore the whispers. They warned their children not to play with Jesse, not to follow him anywhere. Yet some children, either too young to understand the danger or too trusting, still fell into his traps. Jesse's progression fits a disturbing pattern recognized by criminologists today. Many serial offenders begin with small acts, bullying, animal cruelty, minor assaults, and then escalate. Each act becomes a rehearsal, a test of boundaries. When they realize they can get away with it, they push further. Jesse was following this pattern exactly, except he was doing it at an age when most children are still learning to spell properly. By late 1871, Jesse's reputation in Boston was darkening. He was no longer just the odd boy with the white eye. He was becoming something more sinister in the eyes of the community. The children whispered his name with fear, and the parents spoke of him as a dangerous presence. Yet because he was still a child, no one could fully believe what he was capable of. No one, that is, until he committed his first murder. In the early months of 1872, a terrible event shook the community and transformed Jesse Pomeroy from a disturbing bully into something far worse, a killer. The victim was a young boy named William Payne, only 4 years old. On a cold December day, William disappeared from his neighborhood. His family searched desperately, but there was no sign of him. Days later, William's body was discovered in Dorchester Bay. The sight was horrifying. His small form bore the marks of brutal violence. He had been slashed repeatedly, his throat cut, his body discarded like trash. The crime stunned Boston. The newspapers quickly seized on the story, publishing lurid details about the murder of an innocent child. For a city already uneasy about Jesse's behavior, suspicion fell immediately on him. After all, Jesse had a history of luring children, of violence with knives, and of cruelty that seemed beyond his years. But proving Jesse's guilt in William Payne's murder was not straightforward. At the time, forensic science was primitive. Fingerprints were not yet widely used, and DNA testing was still a century away. The police had to rely on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and intuition. Some officers were convinced Jesse was responsible, while others hesitated to accuse a boy of such a horrific crime. Meanwhile, the neighborhood descended into fear. Parents kept their children indoors. Rumors swirled about the Pomeroy boy, who was whispered to be capable of anything. The newspapers added fuel to the fire, describing Jesse as a fiend in the form of a child, a monster with the face of innocence but the heart of a killer. Jesse, for his part, seemed unfazed by the suspicion. He continued to move through the streets with a strange calm, even as people eyed him warily. His mother defended him fiercely, insisting he was being unfairly targeted because of his eye and his past troubles. She maintained that Jesse was not capable of murder. But Jesse's actions told a different story. Rather than lying low after William Payne's murder, Jesse grew bolder. It was as if killing had awakened something inside him, a hunger that could no longer be satisfied with mere threats or beatings. He wanted more. He wanted the thrill of watching life slip away from another human being. The police may not have been able to prove Jesse's guilt in William Payne's case, but Jesse himself knew the truth. And soon, he would kill again, this time leaving behind evidence that no one could ignore. In March of 1874, the city of Boston was shaken once again. This time, the victim was not a toddler but a young girl named Katie Curran, just 10 years old. Katie had gone missing after telling friends she planned to visit a local shop to buy a notebook. When she never returned home, her family launched a frantic search. For days, there was no trace of her. Then rumors began to circulate. Some children whispered that Katie had been last seen near the store owned by Jesse's mother, Ruth Ann Pomeroy. Jesse sometimes worked there, and neighbors wondered if Katie had crossed his path. The truth would soon emerge in horrifying detail. Katie's body was eventually discovered in the basement of the Pomeroy store. She had been brutally murdered, stabbed repeatedly, her throat slashed, her small frame hidden beneath piles of ashes and debris. The discovery shocked even seasoned police officers. It was not only the brutality of the killing but the cold-bloodedness of hiding her body so close to home. This time, the evidence pointed directly to Jesse. Witnesses placed Katie near the shop on the day she disappeared. The brutality of the attack matched Jesse's known pattern of violence. And most damning of all, the hiding place suggested knowledge of the store, a place Jesse had access to daily. The community's fear turned to outrage. The newspapers exploded with headlines branding Jesse as a monster in human form. The boy fiend, they called him, the youngest serial killer in America. Editorials questioned how a child could harbor such evil. Some demanded his immediate execution, while others argued that a boy of 14 could not truly understand the weight of his actions. Jesse was arrested and brought before the court. He showed little emotion, his pale face and blind eye giving him an eerie, almost otherworldly appearance. Some reporters noted that he seemed detached, as if he were watching the events unfold from a distance, unconcerned by the gravity of the charges against him. For the people of Boston, the case of Katie Curran's murder confirmed their worst fears. Jesse Pomeroy was no longer just a troubled boy. He was a killer, and not just once, but twice. The city demanded justice, parents clutched their children closer, and society struggled with an impossible question. What do you do with a murderer who is still, legally, a child? The trial would soon provide an answer, but it would not bring peace. Instead, it would ignite one of the most controversial debates in American legal history. Should a child be executed for murder, or should mercy be granted even to a monster? By the time Jesse Pomeroy was 11, the pattern of his violence could no longer be ignored. Whispers in the neighborhood had transformed into open accusations. Too many children had returned home with bruises, cuts, and stories too similar to dismiss. Mothers scolded their sons for playing with Jesse, and fathers warned their children to avoid him. But Jesse was clever. He used charm, promises, and sometimes intimidation to lure his victims. The complaints eventually reached the Boston police. At first, they found it difficult to believe that a boy so young could be responsible for such cruelty, but as more testimonies emerged, the truth became undeniable. Jesse was not just an unruly child, he was something far more dangerous. In 1871, Jesse was finally arrested. Several boys, some as young as 5, came forward to describe how Jesse had attacked them. Their accounts were chillingly similar. He would invite them to follow him into remote areas, empty lots, marshes, or train yards before tying them up and whipping them mercilessly. Sometimes he cut them with a knife. Other times he pressed the blade against their throats, whispering threats of death if they told anyone. The police, horrified by the consistency of the stories, brought Jesse in. Reports from the time described the strange contradiction of his appearance. A pale, thin boy with soft features, one eye milky white, who looked more like a sickly schoolchild than a monster. And yet, when the victims pointed at him and confirmed he was their attacker, the image of the boy fiend began to solidify. When Jesse was placed before a judge, the court was faced with a dilemma. He was guilty, there was no question of that, but what punishment could be given to a child of only 11? Prison was considered too harsh. Executing him for assault was out of the question, and so the court decided on what seemed like a more merciful compromise. Jesse would be sent to a reform school. The reform school was intended as a place for wayward boys, a mixture of discipline, education, and hard labor designed to straighten out juvenile delinquents. Judges at the time believed that boys who committed crimes could be corrected if only they were placed in the right environment. In theory, Jesse's stay there would reform his violent tendencies. But for Jesse, reform school became something else entirely. The institution was harsh, overcrowded, and often brutal. Boys were whipped for misbehavior, starved for disobedience, and humiliated into submission. For many children, the system was traumatic, but for Jesse, it was an education. He learned how to mask his darker urges, how to appear obedient, and how to hide his true nature. Inside, he fantasized about the violent acts he wished to carry out, but he kept them buried, biding his time until he was free again. He served just 15 months in reform school before being released early for good behavior. On paper, Jesse had been rehabilitated. In reality, he was more dangerous than ever. The reform school where Jesse spent his sentence was officially known as the Westboro House of Reformation. It was located outside Boston, and its purpose was to house juvenile offenders considered too young for prison but too dangerous to be left free. Daily life at the institution was grim. The boys woke early to the sound of bells and were forced into strict routines of labor and schooling. They worked in workshops, fields and kitchens, all under the watchful eye of guards who were quick to punish disobedience. Whippings were common, food was meager, medical care was minimal. For most boys, reform school was meant to break the spirit of rebellion. But Jesse was not like most boys. He didn't see the punishments as lessons. Instead, he saw them as proof that cruelty was the language of power. If adults could use pain to control children, then pain must be the ultimate tool of authority. And so Jesse studied, not just in the classroom, but in the behavior of those around him. He noticed how weaker boys suffered, how they cried, how they cowered. He stored those images in his mind, adding them to his growing catalogue of fantasies. While there, Jesse also developed a talent for deception. He learned how to mimic obedience, how to lower his head and pretend remorse. He realized that if he played the role of a reformed boy, he could win the approval of his keepers. And it worked. Reports from the institution described Jesse as a quiet boy who followed orders. He was released early in 1872 for good conduct. But what the reform school failed to recognize was that Jesse had simply learned to wear a mask. His violent urges had not disappeared. They had only been hidden beneath a surface of false compliance. When Jesse returned to his family, his mother welcomed him warmly. She believed he had been changed, that the time in reform school had set him on a better path. But neighbors remained suspicious. They had not forgotten the stories, the scars left on children, or the rumors that Jesse had harmed animals and enjoyed watching their suffering. And soon, their suspicions would prove justified. Within months of his release, Jesse resumed his violent behavior. Only now, he was more careful, more cunning. He avoided drawing attention to himself until it was too late. The reform school had not reformed Jesse Pomeroy. It had taught him patience, control and deception, skills that would make his next crimes even more terrifying. When Jesse walked out of the reform school in 1872, he was only 13 years old, but already he was far from an ordinary boy. He had spent over a year fantasizing about violence, replaying in his mind the screams of his former victims and imagining what it would be like to go further, to take a life. The world outside the reform school seemed the same, but Jesse was not. He had learned how to suppress his urges when necessary, how to trick adults into believing he was harmless, and how to manipulate those around him. Now, free again, he was ready to act. At first, Jesse returned to old patterns. He lured younger children into secluded areas and assaulted them. Victims described beatings, knife threats, and cruel taunts. But something was different now. Jesse wasn't just inflicting pain for the sake of it. He was testing boundaries, pushing closer and closer to the edge of murder. In late 1872, Boston was shocked by the disappearance of William Payne, a 4-year-old boy whose mutilated body was discovered days later. The brutality of the killing bore Jesse's mark: slashes, stabbings, and signs of torture. Though police suspected Jesse, they lacked concrete evidence to convict him. The community whispered, but Jesse remained free. His next crime, however, would leave no doubt. In March 1874, Jesse lured Katie Curran, a 10-year-old girl, to his mother's shop. Katie was last seen entering the store, and then she vanished. Days later, police searching the basement discovered her body. She had been stabbed repeatedly, her throat cut, and her body hidden under ashes and boards. This murder shocked Boston to its core. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the sheer audacity of hiding the body so close to home. Jesse had grown bolder, reckless, intoxicated by his own sense of power. The arrest came swiftly. Witnesses placed Katie at the shop, the evidence of the hiddies. Body pointed directly to Jesse. Newspapers exploded with headlines branding him the boy fiend and the youngest serial killer in America. At only 14, Jesse Pomeroy had crossed the final line. He was no longer just a boy with violent urges. He was a killer, and society now faced a chilling question. What punishment could possibly fit the crimes of a child who killed like a monster? The story of Jesse Pomeroy's first confirmed murder begins in late 1872 with the disappearance of a boy named William Payne. William was just 4 years old, innocent, vulnerable, and completely defenseless against the predator who targeted him. At first, William's family thought he might have wandered off while playing. Children often did, and the streets of Boston were filled with kids who roamed freely from one neighborhood to another. But as hours turned into days, worry turned into dread. Flyers went up, neighbors searched alleys and fields, and the community rallied to find him. Then came the discovery. William's small, lifeless body was found near Dorchester Bay. The condition of his body horrified even the most hardened investigators. He had been stripped, slashed with knives, and beaten mercilessly. His throat had been cut so deeply that it left no doubt about the intent. This was not an accident, nor a childish prank gone wrong. This was murder. Boston was stunned. Newspapers printed vivid descriptions of the crime, emphasizing the innocence of the victim. A 4-year-old child, slaughtered as though he were nothing more than an animal. The brutality was shocking, not only because of William's age, but because of the sheer savagery of the wounds. Whoever had killed him had taken time, had inflicted suffering deliberately. The police immediately began investigating, but they faced a chilling realization. The details of the murder resembled the earlier attacks by Jesse Pomeroy. The knife wounds, the torture, the sadistic escalation, it all bore his signature. Neighbors whispered Jesse's name. Mothers pulled their children closer when he walked by. But proving it was another matter entirely. The science of forensics was virtually non-existent. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no clear physical evidence linking Jesse to the crime. The police had suspicion, but not proof. Jesse, meanwhile, carried on with his life. He seemed almost indifferent to the storm swirling around him. Some accounts describe him smiling or even smirking when neighbors looked at him with fear. Whether he felt pride, amusement, or nothing at all is impossible to say, but one thing was clear. Jesse wasn't worried. He seemed to know the system couldn't touch him. Not yet. For William Payne's family, justice never came. His death was officially unsolved at the time, though everyone in Boston seemed to know who the true killer was. The whispers grew louder. Jesse wasn't just a bully, he was a murderer. But the terrifying part was this. William Payne's death didn't satisfy Jesse, it only awakened a hunger for more. To understand Jesse Pomeroy's crimes, we have to look at his method of killing. Unlike many killers driven by impulse, Jesse displayed a disturbing level of control and sadism. He didn't simply kill, he tortured. He prolonged the suffering of his victims as though that were the true purpose of his actions. In the case of William Payne, the brutality spoke volumes. Jesse didn't strike quickly or end the child's life in a moment of rage. Instead, he inflicted wounds methodically, as if experimenting with pain. The slashes, cuts, and beatings suggested he was exploring how far he could go. The killing blow, the deep cut across the throat, came only after he had already reduced the child to a state of terror and agony. This was consistent with Jesse's earlier assaults on children before his first murder. Victims who survived described being tied up, stripped, whipped, and cut. Jesse threatened to blind them, pressing knives to their eyes. He seemed fascinated by the idea of mutilation, of destroying the most vulnerable parts of the body. These were not random attacks. They followed a pattern of sadism, domination, torture, fear, and finally, release, whether through escape or death. Psychologists today might describe Jesse's behavior as psychopathic. He lacked empathy, enjoyed control, and derived pleasure from suffering. At just 12 years old, he displayed characteristics more commonly associated with adult serial killers, and yet he was only a boy. That was what made him so terrifying. Jesse's use of knives was also significant. He carried them often, and he treated them almost as extensions of himself. Witnesses recalled how he sharpened blades, examined them, and even brandished them during ordinary interactions. Knives gave him power. They were the tools through which he could transform his fantasies into reality. But perhaps the most chilling part of Jesse's method was his lack of remorse. After William Payne's murder, Jesse didn't hide in fear. He didn't show guilt or sorrow. Instead, he seemed emboldened, as if killing had given him a new sense of control over his world. The newspapers, desperate to explain how a child could commit such acts, described him as a born fiend, or a monster in human form. They suggested he was insane, possessed, or cursed. But Jesse's actions weren't random madness. They were deliberate, calculated, and disturbingly consistent. This sadistic method would appear again in his next crime, the murder of Katie Curran, where Jesse escalated his violence and revealed just how cold-blooded he had truly become. In March of 1874, Boston was once again plunged into horror. This time, the victim was Katie Curran, a bright, cheerful 10-year-old girl. Katie lived not far from the Pomeroy family and, like many children in the neighborhood, was familiar with Jesse. On the day she disappeared, Katie told friends she was going to a shop to buy a notebook. That shop was run by Jesse's mother, Ruth Ann. Katie never came home. Her disappearance sparked immediate alarm. Families remembered William Payne, and whispers spread quickly. Could Jesse be involved again? The police began searching, but for days there was no trace of Katie. Her family clung to hope, but in their hearts they feared the worst. Their fears were confirmed when police decided to search the basement of the Pomeroy store. There, hidden beneath piles of ashes and boards, they found Katie's body. The sight was horrifying. She had been stabbed repeatedly. Her throat had been slashed, mirroring the method used on William Payne. Her body had been crudely hidden, as though Jesse believed no one would look so close to home. This time, the evidence was undeniable. Witnesses confirmed Katie had gone to the store the day she disappeared. The brutality of the murder matched Jesse's established pattern, and most damning of all, the body was found in his family's property. Boston erupted in outrage. The newspapers exploded with sensational headlines. The boy fiend strikes again. The youngest serial killer in America. A monster at 14. People demanded justice. Some called for Jesse's immediate execution, arguing that age should not protect someone capable of such crimes. Others questioned whether a boy could truly comprehend the weight of murder, urging mercy instead. Jesse was arrested and charged with Katie's murder. In court, he displayed the same unnerving calm he had shown before. Reporters noted his lack of emotion, his pale face, and the eerie white eye that seemed to unsettle everyone who looked at him. He didn't cry, he didn't beg, and he didn't seem to care. For many, Katie's death confirmed what they had feared all along. Jesse Pomeroy was not just a troubled child. He was a predator, a killer, and a monster hiding in the body of a boy. The trial that followed would not only determine Jesse's fate, but also spark one of the most heated debates in American legal history. What should society do when its most dangerous criminal is also its youngest? The murder of Katie Curran shook Boston to its core. The death of William Payne 2 years earlier had already left scars, but many had clung to the hope that perhaps that tragedy was an isolated horror. Now, with another child brutally murdered, that illusion shattered. Boston was no longer a city of bustling streets and carefree children. It had transformed into a place where fear lurked in every shadow. Parents no longer allowed their children to walk to school alone. Shops, once filled with laughter and chatter, grew quiet as mothers clutched their sons and daughters tightly, unwilling to let them out of sight. The newspapers fed the panic. Daily headlines screamed about the boy fiend and America's youngest murderer. Some articles printed grotesque descriptions of Katie's injuries, stirring outrage and terror. Others called for Jesse to be hanged immediately, demanding that the courts act swiftly before he could strike again. The effect on the community was profound. Before Jesse, crime in Boston was largely associated with drunken brawls, theft, or occasional gang violence. But the idea of a child, barely a teenager, stalking, torturing, and murdering other children was beyond comprehension. He wasn't just another criminal. He was seen as something unnatural, something monstrous. Neighborhood meetings were held, and parents pressured local authorities to act. Ministers preached sermons about sin and corruption, warning that Jesse was proof of the devil's influence in society. Some said his strange white eye marked him as cursed. Others whispered that he was insane, incapable of understanding right from wrong. But fear quickly turned into rage. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting for Jesse's death. They carried signs, some reading, "Hang the boy fiend," and "Justice for Katie." To many, Jesse was no longer a boy deserving of sympathy. He was a beast who needed to be put down. At the same time, a strange fascination grew. Jesse's case became front-page news across the country. Reporters described his appearance in lurid detail: the pale skin, the scarred face, the unsettling white eye. People were horrified, yet they couldn't look away. How could a child commit such atrocities? What did this say about human nature, about the limits of innocence? The panic didn't stop at Boston. Families in neighboring towns grew fearful, believing Jesse's crimes might inspire other children. Rumors spread that he had accomplices, or that he was part of a larger gang of child murderers. None of it was true, but fear has a way of breeding wild stories. In the midst of all this chaos stood Jesse himself, silent, detached, and seemingly indifferent to the storm he had created. He showed no signs of remorse, no flicker of fear as he faced a city united in hatred against him. For many, that lack of humanity was the most terrifying part of all. Boston had seen crime before. But Jesse Pomeroy wasn't a common criminal. He was something new, something darker, and the community, paralyzed by panic, demanded blood. After Katie Curran's disappearance, Boston police faced mounting pressure. The community demanded swift justice, and all eyes were on the authorities to solve the case. The investigation became one of the most intense in Boston's history up to that point. The first break came from witnesses. Several people reported seeing Katie on the day she vanished. She had mentioned going to a shop run by Jesse's mother. Others recalled seeing her enter the store, but none had seen her leave. This pointed investigators directly toward the Pomeroy family. Detectives began by questioning Jesse. His answers were short, evasive, and delivered with a disturbing calmness. He denied knowing what had happened to Katie, insisting she had never come to the shop. But detectives noticed something chilling. Jesse didn't show the slightest concern. He didn't ask questions, didn't express shock or sympathy. It was as though Katie's disappearance had nothing to do with him. The police pressed harder. They searched the store, combing through shelves, storage rooms, and the basement. At first, they found nothing. But one officer, unsatisfied, insisted on digging deeper, literally. In a pile of ashes and debris in the cellar, they uncovered something that would seal Jesse's fate: the lifeless body of Katie Curran. The discovery was horrific. Katie had been stabbed multiple times, her throat cut, and her small frame crudely hidden beneath boards and ash. The brutality mirrored the earlier killing of William Payne. The investigators knew instantly they had their killer. But even with the body, police needed to build a strong case. They gathered witness statements, physical evidence, and past reports of Jesse's violent behavior. Survivors of his earlier attacks came forward once again, describing how Jesse had tied them up, whipped them, and threatened them with knives. The pattern was undeniable. Still, the investigation faced challenges. Jesse was a minor, just 14 at the time, and the legal system wasn't designed to handle children accused of capital crimes. Some officers worried that Jesse might escape true justice because of his age. Others argued that he was so dangerous that age couldn't matter. The police also examined Jesse's background. They interviewed teachers, neighbors, and reform school staff. Many described him as cruel, uncontrollable, or strange. One reform school report noted that Jesse showed no improvement during his time there, that he was violent and manipulative even under strict supervision. All of this painted a damning picture. Jesse wasn't a child who made a mistake. He was a predator, methodical and sadistic, whose crimes had escalated from bullying to torture to murder. By the time the police finished their investigation, the case against Jesse was overwhelming. The community's suspicions were confirmed, the evidence was irrefutable, and Boston prepared for one of the most infamous trials in American history. On April 22nd in 1874, police made their move. With evidence in hand, they arrested Jesse Pomeroy for the murder of Katie Curran. The scene was chaotic. Crowds gathered outside his home and along the streets, shouting curses and demands for justice. Some threatened to storm the police wagon and lynch him on the spot. Jesse, however, remained eerily calm. Witnesses described him walking into custody without resistance, his pale face expressionless. There were no tears, no outbursts, no signs of fear. It was as though he didn't fully grasp the enormity of what was happening, or worse, that he simply didn't care. At the police station, Jesse was formally charged. Officers recounted that he answered questions with cold detachment, never wavering, never flinching. When asked why he had done it, Jesse gave no clear answer. Some reports claim he muttered vague explanations about not being able to help himself, while others say he simply shrugged, as though the murder of a 10-year-old girl meant nothing at all. The arrest made front-page news across the nation. Headlines screamed, "The boy murderer caught, monster in chains, and a fiend at 14. People from all walks of life followed the story with horrified fascination. How could a child, barely into his teenage years, commit crimes so brutal that even hardened criminals were shocked? The legal system now faced an unprecedented challenge. Jesse Pomeroy was clearly guilty, but he was also a minor. Could the state of Massachusetts sentence a 14-year-old to death? Should they? The debate would rage in newspapers, courtrooms, and households alike. Meanwhile, Jesse sat in his cell, seemingly unaffected by the chaos outside. Guards observed him closely, expecting breakdowns or emotional outbursts, but Jesse remained steady, cold, and detached. Some said he looked bored, others that he seemed amused by the attention. On the final arrest marked the end of Jesse's freedom, but the beginning of an even bigger story, the trial that would decide not only his fate but also set a precedent in American law about how society should deal with its youngest monsters. Boston had demanded justice. Now it was time for the courts to deliver it. The trial of Jesse Pomeroy officially began in December 1874, but the road to that moment had been paved with months of tension, speculation, and public outrage. By the time the young boy entered the courtroom, he was no longer just a suspect in the eyes of the people. He was already condemned in the court of public opinion. To many, the trial was not about guilt or innocence. It was about what punishment this boy monster deserved. The courtroom was packed from wall to wall. Curious onlookers crowded the benches, reporters jotted notes furiously, and guards stood rigid at their posts. Mothers clutched their children tightly, as though the mere presence of Jesse posed a threat, even behind iron bars. The atmosphere was electric, part horror show, part moral theater. When Jesse was escorted into the room, the silence was deafening. He appeared younger than his years, small in frame, pale and thin. His disfigurement, the white, almost ghostly eye, was unmistakable. Some spectators gasped, convinced his appearance alone revealed his guilt. Others whispered about the devil, claiming the boy was cursed, marked from birth as a fiend. But Jesse himself remained eerily calm. He sat quietly, hands folded, showing no nervousness or remorse. He avoided eye contact with the crowd and seemed uninterested in the proceedings. This unnerving composure unsettled the jury from the very start. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Jesse as a cold-blooded killer, carefully recounting the brutal murders of William Payne and Katie Curran. Witnesses described the horror of finding Katie's body hidden in the basement, mutilated and discarded like trash. Others recalled Jesse's earlier sadistic assaults on young boys, each incident escalating in cruelty until it culminated in murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple children had survived Jesse's torture and testified against him, their voices trembling as they recounted his threats, his knife, and his chilling laughter. Parents wept in the courtroom, their tears fueling the collective anger of the community. Jesse's defense, however, took a different approach. His lawyers argued that he was not of sound mind. They claimed his disfigurement and troubled childhood had twisted his psyche, leaving him incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. They pleaded for mercy, suggesting he belonged in an asylum rather than the gallows. But the jury was not convinced. Every piece of testimony, every photograph of the victims, every grisly detail chipped away at the notion that Jesse was insane. He was methodical, calculated, and deliberate in his crimes. Insanity, the prosecution argued, would imply chaos. Jesse's acts were not chaotic. They were chillingly precise. The newspapers turned the trial into national theater. Headlines like "The Boy Fiend Faces Justice" and "Monster on Trial" dominated the front pages. People across America followed every word, unable to comprehend how a boy could commit such acts. Some demanded his execution, while a smaller minority, clergy, social reformers, and child advocates, pleaded for leniency, arguing that his youth made capital punishment immoral. Day after day, the trial unfolded like a grim spectacle. The evidence stacked higher, the testimonies more damning, and Jesse's cold, detached demeanor only confirmed the public's worst fears. The courtroom wasn't just a place of justice, it was a stage where society wrestled with the unimaginable. A child predator, a child killer, a child without a conscience. When the prosecution rested its case, the question was no longer, did Jesse do it? Everyone knew the answer. The real question was, what should be done with him? The trial of Jesse Pomeroy was more than a local case. It became a national obsession. Newspapers from New York, Philadelphia, and even London carried the story, dubbing Jesse the Boy Fiend, the 12-year-old monster, and America's youngest serial killer. For the public, the shock came not only from the brutality of the crimes, but from the age of the perpetrator. Society had always viewed children as symbols of innocence, purity, and vulnerability. But Jesse shattered that image. He was proof that evil could exist in its rawest form within the body of a child. Communities across the nation debated what Jesse's case meant. Was he born evil? Was his violence the product of abuse, neglect, or bullying? Or was he simply a freak of nature, an anomaly in the human race? Families, clergymen, and intellectuals grappled with the horrifying implications. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. Mothers wept openly in court. Fathers clenched their fists in anger. Outside the courthouse, mobs gathered daily, demanding Jesse's execution. Some carried effigies of the boy, burning them in protest. Others shouted, "Hang him! Hang the fiend!" But amid the rage, there was also a strange fascination. People bought newspapers not just for the news, but for the morbid thrill of reading about Jesse. Sketch artists drew haunting images of him, the small, pale boy with the staring eye. Writers compared him to characters from Gothic novels, calling him a real-life Frankenstein or a demon in a child's body. This fascination spread to the broader culture. Poets wrote verses about him, some condemning, others eerie and sympathetic. Pamphlets were printed, warning parents to keep a close watch on their children. The case was not only about crime, it became a moral lesson, a warning about the thin line between innocence and depravity. The shock even reached the government. Massachusetts legislators debated whether existing laws were adequate to handle such a case. Some argued that Jesse should be treated as an adult regardless of his age. Others warned that executing a child, even one as monstrous as Jesse, would be a stain on the state's conscience. Meanwhile, Jesse himself seemed untouched by the storm outside. Reporters noted that he rarely reacted during testimony. When photographs of his victims were displayed, he did not flinch. When parents sobbed in court, he did not look up. His lack of humanity, his refusal to show even a flicker of remorse, only deepened the public's horror. The shock wasn't limited to his murders. It was also about what Jesse represented. If a boy could commit such atrocities, what did that say about childhood, about society, about human nature itself? Could other children be hiding such darkness? The case forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about crime, punishment, and the limits of empathy. By the time the trial neared its end, Jesse Pomeroy was no longer just a boy in chains. He was a symbol of terror, a living reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like children. One of the central debates of Jesse Pomeroy's trial was whether he was insane or simply evil. The question divided doctors, lawyers, and the public. In the 1870s, psychology was still a developing field. Terms like sociopath or psychopath were not yet widely used. Instead, people spoke of madness, hysteria, or demonic possession. Jesse's case became a test of how far science and society could go in understanding the human mind. Doctors examined him closely. Some reported that Jesse showed signs of mental illness. They argued that his uncontrollable violent impulses, his lack of empathy, and his fixation on torture indicated insanity. They claimed he could not distinguish between right and wrong, that he was driven by urges beyond his control. Others disagreed. They pointed out that Jesse carefully planned his attacks, lured victims with cunning, and hid their bodies to avoid detection. These were not the actions of a madman, but of a calculating predator. Insanity, they said, would mean chaos and confusion. Jesse was cold and deliberate. The press fueled the debate. Articles asked, is Jesse a monster born of nature, or a victim of circumstance? Some blamed his physical deformity, the white eye that set him apart. They claimed years of bullying and rejection had poisoned his soul. Others believed his appearance was irrelevant, that evil simply lived inside him. Ministers entered the discussion too. Sermons described Jesse as proof of original sin, a child consumed by the devil's influence. They warned parents that without moral guidance, any child could fall into darkness. The public, however, was less philosophical. Most people saw Jesse not as sick, but as wicked. His calmness, his lack of remorse, and the sheer brutality of his crimes left little room for sympathy. The idea that he might escape execution because of insanity enraged them. But the psychologists in Cal questions lingered. If Jesse was insane, did that absolve him of responsibility? And if he was not, did that mean he chose to commit such horrors freely? The case forced Americans to wrestle with the boundaries of childhood, morality, and criminal justice. In the end, whether Jesse was a monster or a madman hardly mattered to the grieving families of his victims. What mattered was that their children were dead. What mattered was that justice be served. The trial was moving toward its climax, and the world waited to see what fate awaited the boy who had shocked an entire nation. When the evidence against Jesse Pomeroy had been laid bare, and when the testimonies of frightened boys and grieving parents had echoed through the courtroom, the question of his guilt was no longer debated. Jesse was guilty. The real storm, the fiercest, most controversial storm, was about what to do with him. Should a boy be put to death? The prosecution pushed hard for the death penalty. Their argument was simple. Jesse Pomeroy had committed acts so heinous that he had forfeited his right to live. He had tortured children, he had mutilated bodies, he had killed not in a frenzy but with calculation, with chilling intent. This boy, one prosecutor thundered, is no boy at all. He is a beast in human form, and the gallows is the only just end for him. The courtroom buzzed with agreement. Parents nodded through tears. Reporters scribbled the words eagerly, knowing they would make bold headlines. But Jesse's defense countered with a plea for mercy. They reminded the court again and again of his age. He was 14, just barely a teenager. Could a civilized society, they asked, place a noose around the neck of a child and drop him into eternity? Would that not make society itself monstrous? The debate spread far beyond the walls of the courtroom. In taverns and parlors, in church pulpits and legislative halls, people argued with fiery passion. Some saw Jesse's execution as necessary justice, a warning to all who might dare follow his path. Others recoiled at the thought of hanging a boy, no matter how terrible his crimes. Newspapers stoked the flames. One editorial declared, "The fiend deserves the rope. His youth is no shield when weighed against the lives he has stolen." Another, however, pleaded, "Shall we as a people descend to barbarity? Let not the Commonwealth of Massachusetts stain itself with the blood of a child." The governor of Massachusetts, William Gaston, found himself at the center of the storm. Letters poured into his office, some demanding Jesse's execution, others begging for clemency. The governor consulted with judges, clergy, and medical professionals. Could the state justify hanging a 14-year-old? Would history judge them cruelly? The debate cut to the core of American values. The nation prided itself on being modern, enlightened, guided by law and morality. Yet here was a test unlike any other. If they executed Jesse, they risked being branded savages. If they spared him, they risked unleashing, or at least failing to properly punish, a murderer. Even within the jury, the debate raged. Men wrestled with their consciences, torn between their outrage at Jesse's crimes and their discomfort with condemning a child to die. In the galleries, spectators whispered prayers or muttered curses. Some longed to see Jesse swing from the gallows, believing only blood could balance the scales. Others, though few, stared at him with pity, seeing not a monster but a boy lost beyond saving. Jesse himself remained cold and silent through it all. When the subject of execution was raised, he showed no fear. He sat still, his pale face expressionless, as if the outcome was irrelevant to him. His lack of visible humanity only deepened the division. To some, it was proof that he was unworthy of mercy. To others, it suggested he was so mentally broken that hanging him would be meaningless vengeance. Thus the trial became less about Jesse's crimes and more about America itself. Could a society that claimed to cherish childhood reconcile with the idea of legally killing a child? The answer would come soon, and it would reverberate for decades. After weeks of heated debate, the verdict finally came. Jesse Pomeroy was found guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted, some in satisfaction, others in outrage. But the real shock came when the sentence was delivered. The judge pronounced that Jesse would not hang. Instead, he would spend the rest of his life in prison, in solitary confinement, with no chance of parole. The reasoning was complex. Legally, Jesse was eligible for the death penalty. Morally, however, the governor and the courts balked. To execute a child would cross a line too dangerous, too grotesque. Massachusetts chose a different path. Jesse would live, but his life would be a cage, stripped of freedom, joy, and hope. The decision ignited fresh waves of debate. For those who had demanded blood, it felt like betrayal. Crowds outside the courthouse hissed and booed when they heard the sentence. Some shouted, "He'll kill again. You've spared a monster." Others muttered that the punishment was worse than death itself. For reformers, the sentence was a grim victory. They argued that locking Jesse away for life was a more civilized solution, one that allowed society to punish without descending into barbarism. "Let him live with his conscience," wrote one minister. "Let him rot in solitude, and may his soul wrestle with God until his dying breath." Jesse, again, showed little reaction. As the words were spoken, he did not cry out or collapse. He simply stared forward, impassive. To those watching, it was as though he felt nothing, neither relief at escaping the rope, nor despair at losing his freedom forever. Soon after, Jesse was transferred to Charlestown State Prison, his new and permanent home. His cell was small, cold, and bare. The walls were grey stone, the light dim, the air heavy. It was here, at just 15 years old, that Jesse began a sentence that would stretch nearly 6 decades. Prison life for Jesse was brutal. Guards treated him with suspicion and hostility, and other prisoners viewed him with contempt. Even among thieves, murderers, and convicts, Jesse was different. His crimes against children made him despised. He was isolated, denied contact, forced into silence and routine. But there was also a sense that this was exactly what society wanted. Jesse Pomeroy, cut off from the world, forgotten, living a life that was neither truly alive nor fully dead. He became a living ghost, a reminder of what humanity could produce when innocence curdled into monstrosity. The decision not to execute Jesse did not end the debate. For years, newspapers revisited the case, questioning whether Massachusetts had shown mercy or weakness. Yet the fact remained. Jesse had escaped the gallows. His punishment was different but no less final. He would never walk free again. The prison gates closed behind Jesse Pomeroy, and with that clang of iron, his world shrank to a space no larger than a few feet. For the next 58 years, this would be his reality. Jesse's life sentence began in near-total solitary confinement. Authorities believed he was too dangerous to be housed among other inmates. His reputation as the boy fiend followed him into Charlestown State Prison, where even hardened criminals recoiled at his presence. To them, he wasn't simply a murderer, he was a child murderer, and that made him untouchable. The isolation was crushing. Jesse spent most of his days locked in a tiny stone cell, permitted out only for exercise in a narrow yard. The monotony was endless. The silence was deafening. For a boy barely into his teens, the punishment was as severe as death. Prison records describe Jesse as a model inmate in terms of discipline. He rarely caused trouble, never engaged in fights, and obeyed orders. But there was an unsettling quality about him. Guards noted his coldness, his lack of connection to others. He lived in his own world, speaking little, reading when he could, and staring for hours into nothing. Over time, Jesse began to write. He filled notebooks with rambling essays, letters, and appeals for release. He argued that he had been misunderstood, that his punishment was unjust, that society had condemned him too harshly. Some of his writings were coherent, others bordered on delusional, but they revealed a mind still restless, still unrepentant. Jesse also tried to escape. More than once. He fashioned crude tools, plotted tunnels, and schemed for freedom. Each attempt failed, and each failure only deepened his confinement. The authorities tightened restrictions, ensuring that Jesse remained locked away. Years turned into decades. Jesse grew from a pale, thin boy into a hardened man, his once youthful face carved with age and bitterness. Yet even as he aged, the stigma of his crimes never faded. To the outside world, he was still the monster child, the boy who had tortured and killed without remorse. New generations learned his name through whispered stories and newspaper clippings. Parents warned their children about him, as though he might still emerge from the shadows. In prison, Jesse lived a strange, dual existence. Physically, he was alive, breathing, eating, moving. But spiritually, he was entombed, forgotten, erased from the world beyond the walls. His cell was not just his punishment, it was his coffin, stretched across decades. For Jesse, life was not freedom, nor was it redemption. It was survival in a cage, the endless ticking of time, and the knowledge that he would die behind bars. The sentence had been delivered. Life without parole. The heavy doors of Charlestown Prison clanged shut behind him. For most men, that was the end of the story. But Jesse Pomeroy was not most men. For decades, his mind churned with a single obsession: escape. Almost immediately, Jesse began to dream of freedom. His young body, barely out of adolescence, still carried the restless energy of youth. He could not imagine spending the rest of his life staring at the same 4 stone walls, so he plotted. At first, the plans were crude. Using scraps of metal hidden from the prison workshop, Jesse tried to fashion picks and blades. One report tells of him attempting to file through the iron bars of his window, the faint rasping sound caught by a passing guard before he could get far. The punishment was swift, stricter confinement, fewer privileges. But Jesse was nothing if not persistent. Years later, he hatched a bolder plan: tunneling. The prison's foundation was strong, but Jesse studied the architecture obsessively. He memorized the routines of guards, mapped the dimensions of his cell, and slowly began to dig. He concealed the dirt under his bedding, a trick older than the prison system itself. Weeks passed, then months. The tunnel deepened inch by inch. For Jesse, each scrape of stone was a taste of hope. Yet, as with all his schemes, discovery came before success. Guards noticed the shifting floor, tore apart his bedding, and exposed the crude excavation. Once again, Jesse was punished, thrown into harsher solitude. Still, he did not stop. Through the 1880s and 1890s, prison records show at least half a dozen escape attempts. Each one was foiled. Tools were found, notes were intercepted. Even fellow prisoners, disgusted by Jesse's crimes, sometimes betrayed his plans to the authorities. And perhaps this was the cruelest irony. Jesse Pomeroy, who had once stalked Chill, Dren with predatory cunning, was never clever enough to outwit the prison system that caged him. His body grew older, weaker, his health declined, yet his fantasies of freedom endured. The guards began to see his escape attempts as almost pathetic, the desperate thrashings of a man who knew he would never breathe fresh air again. But Jesse's persistence revealed something profound about his nature. He was unrepentant. He never accepted his punishment. He never truly believed he belonged behind bars. To his final days, he imagined himself escaping, starting over, even though the world beyond the prison walls had long since forgotten him. The boy who once terrorized Boston became a man trapped in his own delusion, clawing endlessly against the iron bars of fate and failing every time. While Jesse rotted in his cell, the world outside moved on. New scandals, new crimes, new wars dominated the headlines, yet every so often his name returned, whispered like a ghost from the past. Jesse Pomeroy, the boy fiend. In the decades after his trial, Jesse became a kind of dark legend in Boston folklore. Parents would invoke his story as a warning. "Don't wander off alone," mothers would say to their children. "Remember what happened when Jesse Pomeroy was around?" His face, one eye pale, the other dark, became an image etched into the city's collective memory. Newspapers kept his name alive too. Whenever a new juvenile crime shocked the nation, reporters compared the culprit to Jesse. "Is this the new Pomeroy?" the headlines asked. His story became a measuring stick for evil in youth. For true crime enthusiasts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jesse was a fascination. Writers dissected his childhood, speculated about his psychology, and debated whether he had been born a monster or made one by circumstance. Was it his abusive upbringing, his strange appearance, his isolation, or was he simply evil by nature? Some reformers, however, used his case as ammunition in larger debates about juvenile justice. They argued that Jesse's story proved the system needed better ways to handle violent youth. Reform schools, they said, clearly failed. Jesse had only grown worse after his time there. Others countered that no system could have saved him, that he was proof some souls are simply beyond redemption. In Boston, his crimes became part of the city's dark folklore. Tour guides whispered about the locations where Jesse lured his victims. His name turned up in local histories, always with a shudder. Children, generations later, would hear rumors of the boy who killed, a boogeyman figure rooted in fact. And for Jesse himself, he seemed to know he had become infamous. In his writings, he sometimes railed against the way the press portrayed him. He called it slander, injustice, exaggeration. But other times he seemed to embrace it, as though the nickname, the boy fiend, gave him a kind of dark immortality. In truth, it did. Jesse Pomeroy outlived his crimes not by walking free, but by living rent-free in the nightmares and imaginations of a society that could never quite forget him. His name became legend, etched alongside Lizzie Borden and H. Holmes in the grim catalogue of American horror. Time is the one jailer no man can escape. For Jesse Pomeroy, who had once been the youngest murderer in American history, the years stretched into decades, and the decades into a lifetime. By the 1920s, Jesse was an old man. His once sharp, unsettling gaze had dimmed. The pale, blind eye remained, but his hair had thinned, his body stooped. He was no longer the boy who had inspired terror. He was a relic of another century, living out his final days in the cold confines of Salem prison. His health deteriorated steadily. Arthritis crippled his movements. His eyesight worsened. His voice grew faint. Yet still, he clung to his writings, filling page after page with petitions for release, letters to governors, essays defending himself. Even in old age, Jesse refused to accept his punishment. He insisted to the end that he had been misunderstood, mistreated, misjudged. But no governor pardoned him. No parole board listened. The world had no interest in freeing the boy fiend. Finally, in September 1932, Jesse Pomeroy died in prison at the age of 72. He had spent 58 years behind bars, longer than many men live in total. At the time of his death, he was the longest-serving prisoner in Massachusetts history. His passing made headlines, but they were brief. Jesse Pomeroy dead, one paper announced. The articles recapped his crimes, his trial, his decades of confinement, but the public did not mourn. There were no tears, no vigils, no eulogies. His death was not a tragedy. It was a closing of a chapter long kept open. The prison buried him quietly. There was no grand funeral, no legacy of respect, just a grave, a name, and the echo of his crimes. For the families of his victims, his death may have brought some sense of closure, though true healing had long since passed into memory. For society, his passing was a reminder of a question still unresolved. What do we do with children who commit monstrous acts? In the end, Jesse Pomeroy's life was not redeemed. He died as he had lived, reviled, feared, and set apart from humanity. And so, the story of Jesse Pomeroy comes to its final chapter. A boy born in 1859, a child feared by other children, a teenager who tortured, maimed, and killed, a courtroom spectacle, a prisoner for nearly 6 decades, a man who died behind bars, forgotten by most but remembered in whispers. What then is Jesse's legacy? On one level, he is remembered as a monster. His crimes against children stripped him of sympathy, and history has never softened its judgment. Even today, his name sends a chill. He remains America's youngest serial killer, the child who proved that evil does not wait for adulthood. On another level, his story is a mirror for society. The debates that raged over Jesse's punishment, execution versus imprisonment, still echo in modern conversations about juvenile justice. Can children truly understand the weight of their crimes? Should they be punished as adults? Or is mercy possible, even for the merciless? Jesse Pomeroy's case does not offer easy answers. It offers only haunting questions. For storytellers, his tale is a reminder of how truth can be more terrifying than fiction. For parents, it is a cautionary legend passed down through generations, and for the justice system, it remains a landmark case. One that shaped how America grapples with the darkest crimes committed by its youngest citizens. As we close this chapter, we return to the image of Jesse at 12 years old, a boy with one pale eye, a boy who should have been playing in the streets, dreaming of the future, living the innocence of youth. Instead, he became a predator, a murderer, a figure who, more than a century later, still forces us to confront the unimaginable, the monster that can live inside a child. This has been the story of the 12-year-old monster, Jesse Pomeroy, America's youngest serial killer, 1871. If this story chilled you, if it made you reflect on the thin line between innocence and evil, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. And for more true crime stories that dive deep into the shadows of history, subscribe, because the past still has secrets to tell.